Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 8th event of our speaker series, Social Policy Unpacked, Exploring Pathways for Green and Digital Transitions. It's a series co-organized by DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion and the ZOE Institute for Future-fit Economies, and it's funded under the Horizon Europe program. My name is Christoph Gran. I am the co-founder of the ZOE Institute, which is a think tank specialized on co-creation, new economic thinking, and bridging, well, if there's a gap between science and policy. Before we come to today's speakers, Professor Julia Steinberger, let me quickly introduce the series. We want to invite you, everybody, the public, policymakers, whoever is here today, to think outside the box, be inspired with new ideas, and make sure that the Green Deal, that the transition we're in the midst of to live within planetary boundaries is going to be successful and fair. We have 12 online seminars running from December 22 until June 23. And yeah, the next event will be on May 24th with Professor Milena Bux on equity, consumption, and the path towards sustainable welfare. Great, you're here, Milena, today. And yeah, there will be more events to come. Look at LinkedIn, Twitter, on our homepage. You can see it in the chat. And check out the recordings from last events and the homepage, of course. Yeah, the event will be structured as follows. We will start with roughly 30 minutes input from Julia, followed by a Q&A of about 15 minutes. Yeah, hosted with Nadia from the hosting unit F3 at DG Employment and me. And we will already start collecting questions during the talk. You can use the Slido code, the QR code that we put in the chat or that you can see here in the PowerPoint. Of course, you can vote for the questions with thumbs up. I guess most of you have done it already. Enough talking. More than 50 years have passed since the Limits of Growth report, or since Georgescu-Roegen's entropy law and the economic process. Ecological economics might not be known to everybody, but it's a very interesting part of economic thinking and seems that it's finally getting its place in the sun. There's the Beyond Growth conference next week. I guess some of you already registered. If not, I think online it is still possible. In the European Parliament, there is no more place, it's full. And of course, there are sizable grants awarded to research on post-growth, well-being, sustainable prosperity, name it. And it's very exciting to see and to follow what is happening here. And even more exciting is to have Julia Steinberger with us today to present her perspectives on the forefront of this research. Julia is Professor of Societal Challenges of Climate Change at the University of Lausanne. She's lead author of IPCC's 6th assessment report with Working Group 3 and one of the co-recipients of the EREC Synergy Grant for a post-growth deal, the REAL project. Julia, welcome, and yeah, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Christoph, and thanks to everybody. So this is a bit intimidating. I was expecting a nice, cozy, little sort of geeky talk with Zoe, where we could just sort of talk about cool things, and now people showed up, but I hope that you will enjoy yourselves too. So I'll get right into it, because of course the interesting thing is always the questions. And I don't know if that annoying black bar is at the top. I hope it isn't, I hope it's not getting in the way of what you can see on the screen. Okay, so off we go. So basically, I'm just going to talk about two different things. I'm going to talk about the Living Well Within Limits project, which is ending this year, started in 2017. And I'm going to talk about the REAL Post-Growth Deal project, which is starting this year. And so that's a nice continuity. The picture is from a Geneva climate strike in front of the UN. So Living Well Within Limits, this is sort of where we start with the motivation with the Living Well Within Limits project is that this is what I wanted to study. I am a very simple person. I wanted to study the relationship between energy use and its climate implications and human well-being. And that is all I wanted to do in life. And I had a slight problem in my career, which is that mainstream economics is the monkey in the middle, where the monkey is an 800-pound gorilla. And this is a joke we have in the US. I'm not sure if it's that funny, but it's where does a 800-pound gorilla sit? And the answer is wherever he wants to. And so here we have a problem with mainstream economics sort of sitting right in the middle of my research goal, my research question. And this is what happens when your research question is split down the middle by mainstream economics, is that you sort of end up with viewing the world sort of through these neoclassical lenses. And so one of the things you have is you have typical questions that you're allowed to ask on either side. So on the energy economy side, you're allowed to ask, what are the energy requirements of economic activity? The typical answers are efficiency should allow decoupling of energy and economy. And then you have some caveats that you're still allowed to talk about lack of evidence, ignoring rebound, and its effect in growth. And you're basically trying to see the world through a green growth view. Whereas when your economic activity is splitting your question down the middle on the well-being side, you basically end up seeing the world through utility maximization. And that means that when you ask, you're basically left asking, what are the economic requirements of human well-being? And the answer is infinite because of insatiable wants and desires. And then you have, your usual caveats, and you can still publish papers on those, but you're still pretty annoyed. I mean, you're basically saying, listen, there's contradictory evidence. Utility theory might not be all that, but you still are stuck. And so that's why we needed a way to get out of the way of this neoclassical framework. And so what we did is we decided to come up with a new analytic framework, and this is something that we came up with in discussion with Dan O'Neill and William Lamb mainly. I'm not quite sure what to do with this black bar. Sorry, it's annoying me too. So this is our new analytic framework. So what we're doing is, again, we have planetary processes and natural resources on the left, social outcomes like need satisfiers and well-being on the right. And in the middle, instead of having mainstream economics, we basically have an object from heterodox economics, which is provisioning systems. And that's one of the things that heterodox economics tries to do, is it tries to say, listen, we have to understand the economy not as a sort of horizontal market, but we have to understand it as much more complex, possibly vertical structures of these provisioning systems that are both physical and social in nature. So we're talking about socio-technical provisioning systems. We're not talking about just, markets and technologies and all of that. The other thing we're doing here, obviously, is we're getting rid of utility theory in terms of well-being. The well-being framework that we're taking into account here is not hedonic, it's not utility, it is eudaimonic, and it is following the theory of human need of Ian Guth and Len Doyle. So that sort of explains what we're doing on the right-hand side, and I can talk more about that, but let's keep going for now. Okay. So this is basically what we did with the Living Well Within Limits project. So that's, our project sort of summarized in 10 stylized facts. Hopefully we'll have that paper finished by the end of the summer. So we're just basically trying to summarize it. And the way we're trying to do this, it's hard to summarize a lot of cool research in just, a few facts, is that we basically tried to say what we really learned at present and what that tells us about the future. So the first stylized fact is that satisfying human needs does not usually require increasing energy consumption, even in the global south. And in the future, we could satisfy human needs globally using half of our current energy consumption. In terms of energy inequality, this is something that Milena is going to talk about much better next week, so tune in for that. Energy inequality is large and driven literally by the most affluent. Reducing inequality would enable climate mitigation and the elimination of energy poverty in the future. We'll talk about provisioning systems, the political economy of provisioning systems, and transformation, possibly beyond capitalism, as the last step. And so now what I want to do is I just want to go through sort of whirlwind tour of these stylized facts. I believe I put the references in each slide, so you can look at those. There we go. We have references, and the slides are available if you want to have a look in your own time if I'm going too fast. So this notion that satisfying human needs or satisfying well-being does not usually require increasing energy consumption, even in the global south. This is the result of international studies and also within country studies done by Marta Baltrushevitz, especially her 2020 and 2021 papers. So it's obvious that some countries are in very high levels of energy deprivation. However, even in some of those countries, one can find households that manage to live well using lower levels of energy use, even taking their full footprint into account. And one of the things we can learn about is we can learn what factors they have in common. One of the things they have in common is things like very good access to public service infrastructures, including electricity access. So the point here is that it's not the quantity of the energy that matters, but its quality and its distribution and its connection to other public services that matters hugely. And so this is one of the things that we're able to see when we look at sort of these very granular and household level studies. Then we were able to do modeling based on Narasimha's Rao decent living energy framework. We were modeled decent living energy for the entire world. And the headline is in red: decent living energy for all would be achievable. Here I should say with either existing technologies or technologies that have sort of reasonable level of efficiency improvement for all, despite population growth at 40% of current energy use, despite population growth until 2050. What it looks like is shown on the right. You have global final energy use going up. And so that's the reality, is we're around sort of 400 exajoules globally. And in the decent living energy model, we could get down to 156, 160, I think it was around between 150 and 160 exajoules of energy, so quite a bit less. And this is an as low as you can go and still protect people model. So this does not allow for any inequality, but it also does not allow for any deprivation. We're really talking about decent living energy for everybody. So those are that's one of the key findings. Then in terms of inequality, we were able to map energy inequality internationally and intranationally. This is a 2020 paper by Yannick Oswald. And one of the things we were able to do when we did this mapping is we were able to map energy inequality internationally, intranationally, and by product category. And that's where we were able to see using this quadrant where we have at the top of the quadrant. So again, looking only on the right-hand side, at the top of the top half of the quadrant are product categories that are disproportionately consumed by high income households, whereas the bottom half of the quadrant are disproportionately consumed by low income households. And then on the left hand side, we have less energy intensity. On the right hand side, we have more energy intensity, so more energy per dollar spent, more impact in the economy. And what you can see is that energy inequality is driven literally by transport categories. So all the things that are in this luxury and high intensity quadrant are transport categories, and every transport category is in that upper right hand side quadrant. And whereas below in the high intensity but low income quadrant on the bottom, you see heat and electricity, that's energy used in housing. And so you really see this huge split between energy use in transport and energy use in housing. These are two completely different categories in terms of their inequality perspectives. And on the one hand, you can probably think we're not going to get out of the transport problem by green growth, all right, obviously. So we need strategies around taxation regulation. And on the bottom quadrant, we need public investment in efficiency and low carbon energy sources. So this also tells us about differences in policy directions that we should have. Onto the fourth stylized facts, we did a thought experiment. We redistributed income globally, and we saw what it would do. So if we just keep everything else the same and redistribute income globally, where do we get in terms of energy use, and where do we get in terms of energy poverty, and where do we get in terms of types of energy consumption? And this was another paper by Yannick Oswald, came out in 2021. And the headline result is that it doesn't do much to total consumption, changes very little within less than 10%, no matter if you make the world more or less unequal. But what does change is the type of energy used changes. And that's something you can see in the lower left-hand corner, that as your inequality goes up, the transport, so as your Gini coefficient goes up, the transport share goes up. And as your Gini coefficient goes down, the transport share goes down and the housing share, so heat and electricity, the orange bit goes up. And so that's one of the things that really changes things, is that a more equal world, everything else being the same, spends more of its resources on the domestic sphere, on housing, than on transportation. And that also tells us that, in our view, a more equal world would be easier to decarbonize, because we have lots of solutions for electrifying and making housing more efficient. So that was another sort of interesting finding. Well, I think we're on to 5, which is a study that tells us about provisioning systems have an influence on how much need satisfaction can be achieved at different levels of energy use. And this was a paper that was published in 2021 by Joachim Vogel as first author, where he basically looked at which factors, socioeconomic factors in a society, are beneficial and which ones are detrimental for achieving human well-being at low energy use. And the beneficial ones are sort of in the green rectangle here. So public service quality is hugely beneficial. Public health coverage is beneficial. Trade and transport infrastructure are beneficial. Electricity access is mega beneficial. Access to clean fuels. Urban population is also beneficial. And income equality is and democratic quality are both very beneficial. Trade penetration doesn't matter. That's not significant. And foreign direct investments under it are also not significant. But you're basically starting to get the picture of what kind of society is going to be able to do well with less resource use. It's a society that has very good networked infrastructures like electricity and transport. It's a society that has excellent public services and public health coverage. So this is one of the things that we're really seeing coming out of the Living Well Within Limits project, is that if you want people to be okay with less, if you want people to do well with less, public services are the linchpin that really matters when it comes to protecting people in a lower resource consumption society. And it's a more equal society, and it's a society that has some level of democracy. We were able to measure 2 detrimental factors, and this, remember, this is quantitative. This is not ideological. This is not our opinion. This is just what falls out of the data. The detrimental factors are extractivism, which is when an economy is directly dependent upon mining and fossil fuel extraction. That's basically something that's known already since a long time as the resource curse in economics, and Dutch disease or Grommel's disease. I think it has several different names, but let's just call it the resource curse. So we're basically seeing the resource curse show up in the study. And more surprisingly, perhaps, economic growth above a certain income. So this study gave us not just the factor, but the domain of validity. And the domain of validity of economic growth is above a moderate income, basically. So growth-seeking economies have a harder time satisfying the needs of their population at lower levels of energy. But so we thought that was pretty interesting. Regarding provisioning systems, and one of the things that tells us is, in the future, if we change the way our provisioning systems or socioeconomic political economy is organized, we might be able to enable much higher satisfaction of human needs at lower energy use, so that basically we can transform our societies, and that will make a difference, should be able to make a difference in how much well-being people have at any given level of energy use. And we're able to see this in some sort of basic modeling at the household and national level, and we're able to see it in modeling also at the international level. Off we go. We're on to number 7. I hope everybody's feeling suitably dizzy and regretting to have joined this little talk. But anyway, these are our fun results. So I'm just going to show them to you. So this one is about provisioning systems are determined currently by very unequal ownership and power structures of our current economies. And this is something we were able to look at in terms of the provision of car dependence. So we basically looked at the political economy of car dependence, including, for instance, here, the structure of the automotive sector and how that sort of locks in political dependence, the need for continually expanding the market and also lock in on the consumer side. And this was absolutely stellar work by Giulio Mattioli, Cameron Roberts, and in collaboration also with Andrew Brown. So that was really an amazing thing to be able to do. And we also looked at privatization and poverty in the UK. And this is the study on the right by Bayliss, that was led by Kate Bayliss, where you really see the way that the system of provision and privatization of essential services is determining rent extraction on the one hand and sort of cost increases for the poorest shares of the population on the other hand, and how this poses a real problem. So we're basically able to see is that by looking at systems of provision of current economies, we can see that they're locking in economic dependency, so economic rent extraction models and resource intensive use, which is obviously not ideal. And so one of the things that we conclude is that we need to, change we must transform our economies. We must be guided by systemic understanding. I don't think anybody here would disagree with that. And that one of the things that can help with this transformation is democratic and participatory processes. So this is one of the things that we're really trying to think about more, which is how do we democratize provisioning systems? How do we democratize our economy? How do we take back some kind of control and some kind of intelligent decision-making on these large systems? And so that's something that Lina Brandt-Correa was absolutely foundational in thinking about in the project. So these are some of her papers from her PhD and from her postdoc. And then, we have to think about, okay, well, what do we do? Do we move beyond capitalism? What do we need to, how do we need to transform our economies to provide a sufficient, equitable, and universal well-being at low resource use? So these are the questions that we're left with. So now I'll move on to the next bit of the talk. I hope I'm not taking too much time. So, which is basically just a little preview of the ERC Synergy grant REAL, a post-growth deal, which is just started at the beginning of May. So we're really just getting started, basically hiring people at this point. We have a few job offers open. I think there's a major deadline coming on Monday. The major contributions that we want to come up with in this project are around modeling. So we really want to do alternative kinds of modeling and post-growth economic modeling. We want to develop post-growth policy deals for the Europe and for the global South that are based on systemic analysis. So not just, one policy at a time, but really understanding the economy as a whole, and the capitalist economy and financialization as a whole, for instance, and evidence around that. And the third one is that we want to start thinking about implementation. So we want to engage with social movements and with decision makers throughout the project, not just at the end. And in terms of some of the next things that we will be doing that I am most excited about. So we have these 5 work packages. The first one is around sort of modeling and empirical evidence. The second one is around post-growth policies. The third one is around post-growth provisioning. That's my specialty. Oh yeah, I should say that this project is obviously with Jason Hickel and with Yorgos Kallis. So Jason's going to be looking most at the post-growth policies. Yorgos is going to be looking most at the post-growth politics and learning from different political movements and the role of conflict, and also having an aspect on geopolitics. And then we will all of us be working towards bringing post-growth into practice. And just for one more minute, I just want to tell you, so this is sort of our task list. It's insane. We have too many tasks. We have 6 tasks per work package. Somebody should have stopped us before we got to that point, but that's where we went. And I just want to tell you about a couple of the ones that I'm most excited about. So the others would have other ones, presumably. But one of the things I'm really excited about is this sort of triplet of looking at north-south convergence scenarios of resource use, which is something that the current IPCC models don't do, for instance. Coupling that with an understanding of the material prerequisites for decent living, and labor, material, and energy and greenhouse gas footprinting, which is going to allow us to do something around sort of post-growth integrated assessment modeling scenarios. We're basically going to be able to come up with scenarios that model labor, that model resource use, that model energy use in an equitable way. And that's something that I'm really, really excited about. Another part that's very exciting is around policy mapping and mapping on equal exchange. So Jason Hickel is going to be in charge of that, which is then going to lead to post-growth policy deals for the EU and for the Global South. That would be quite interesting to come up with. And around work package 3, I'm very interested in this idea of democratizing provisioning systems. So we're going to try to have a view of what provisioning alternatives would be in different sectors: housing, transport, food, health, you name it. Well, we're really just going to try to map out what alternatives exist out in the world, and then think about ways that we can systematically think about what democratizing means, and also do some modeling there, which is going to be interesting because I'm not quite sure we know how to do that yet, but we will have an interesting time. And I think I will leave it there. Obviously, research is not enough. We also need activism. I was able to participate in some scientist rebellion activities just this week. It's a big week of action for that. And I think that this is something that we really have to take seriously as part of our professional integrity and professional position. So I very much follow Charlie Gardner and Louise Worldly, Charlie Gardner and Claire Worldly, who said the scientists who alerted the world to the climate and ecological crises have a moral duty to join the popular movements demanding political action. And we've been writing other stuff on that as well. Most recently, this paper that was published, I believe, in Nature on civil disobedience by scientists helps press for urgent climate action. So I think that these, we have to do all of these things together right now. Okay, that's it, done. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. We could make a seminar out of this. It's so rich and eyes-opening, and it should be maybe more on this, I guess, for people to dive deeper into this. But I'm very glad that you put all the links in the slides, and we will share it with everybody afterwards. And yeah, I don't know, Nadia, do you want to start with a question, or?
Yes,
you have
I can start
something?
with some questions. It's filling up in the Slido. So, but also please, if you have further questions, you can add them to. You have the link and the code social policy as well. And so my name is Nadia Najjar, and I'm part of DG Employment, the unit working on fair, green, and digital transitions research. So I will be asking some of these questions now from the audience. And so, you presented, I think one of the key messages from your research is that we can satisfy human needs without increasing energy consumption and even using less energy. And there was an interesting question asking, so yeah, what does that mean concretely? What sacrifices does society need to stay within planetary boundaries? And can this be, can this be aligned with our definitions of well-being today? So here the person makes an makes an example. Does it mean, for example, limiting meat consumption or taking a plane? Is this aligned with our Western understanding of well-being or consumption?
So thanks for that, Nadia, and whoever asked the question. So I think that one of the things that we really need to watch out for are these frameworks that counterpose changes in existing consumption patterns that sort of try to present them as universally being sacrifices. And I think that one of the things we can try to remember is that a lot of our consumption is not freely chosen, but is really sort of imposed by these industrial structures that go basically overproduction creates overconsumption. Otherwise, the companies go bust. And so the amount of freedom we have in our current consumption patterns is actually not as big as we might want to believe. And we might also want to remember examples like the tobacco industry and smoking. When we try to think, is it a huge sacrifice to give up my 3 packs of cigarettes a day? Which is, at the time, I'm sure it felt like it. So I think it's just very important to be aware of this framework of this framing of sacrifice as being problematic. In terms of living standards, in terms of what people want to do with their lives, I don't think that this future requires much sacrifice at all. I mean, let's not talk about meat consumption. Let's talk about healthy, tasty diets, right? So people want healthy, tasty diets. That it turns out is perfectly fine on a vegan or vegan-ish diet. And so that's just a question of learning how to do that. And there's a win. I mean, diet is even more insane because there's so many win-wins in terms of health, biodiversity, climate, you name it. It's all winning if you don't eat meat anymore. So we definitely don't need to eat meat anymore. Whether or not we need to frame that as a sacrifice, especially given all the fake meat around and all of that stuff, is a bit unclear to me. It just seems like common sense. And when you see Burger King doing something like saying, turning their entire menu vegan, basically, and saying, this is just what we're going to be doing from now on. And it's Burger King, you know, it really sort of tells me that we're far behind when we're asking that kind of question, that we can really do things quite differently. In terms of living standards, in terms of sort of material comfort, I think that there's also, it's more of a pivot than it is a sacrifice again. It means living in smaller spaces because smaller spaces take less resources, allow denser living in cities, and yeah, that's basically it. But it also means more shared spaces. And this is something that people want more and more. So right now, what we're seeing is that the kinds of housing developments that were pioneered by housing cooperatives are in very high demand by everybody. And private housing developers are having to take over this idea that you have a shared games room and so on, you know, so that the shared spaces, shared guest apartments or whatever, are something that people are sort of taking on as well. So this question of how much is private and how much is shared is also a very, very interesting one to do with what people actually want in terms of sustainable consumption. So it's absolutely clear that the private sphere of consumption changes and is diminished. Whether that corresponds to a sacrifice in living standards or in well-being, I think that that's extremely far from obvious. And it's clear that people live very well and want to live the kinds of lifestyles that are associated with more private frugality and more public luxury, as George Monbiot puts it.
Well, thanks a lot. A very elaborate answer on that. And I have here one question that is really voted the most popular one, and it goes a bit in that direction also on the narrative. So, I mean, you said, yeah, it's really important to communicate how we communicate what we mean about well-being, or what is considered as a sacrifice, or even not communicating as a sacrifice. But here's a question also on how can we communicate these type of results in a way that makes it simply understandable for a wide audience, so less maybe not experts in that field, and to in a sense build a narrative also around well-being that uses less resources or less energy.
Thanks for that. I don't think I'm the best person to know how to communicate things better, because I obviously don't, otherwise I would have done it. But other people are. So there was Léonard Cheminot, there's one paper I didn't speak about, well, there's several, but so Léonard Cheminot, who's I'm just going to put it in the chat, who wrote this beautiful comic on discourses of climate delay, and then Céline Keller is another comic artist who also did one. I'll find Céline's as well. But so there are other people. No, I'll share the Dawn of the ECT one. She did this, which is also on a very scientific topic. So I think that some of these comic artists or cartoon artists are very good at such kind of communication. And I think that that's a really nice medium, actually. We're also working with a team of animators to try to think about some way to sort of make this topic speak differently to people. But I have to say it's a bit challenging. Part of the problem it's a bit challenging is because people come with these frames where they're like, oh, you know, it's all about individual consumption, or, oh, it's all about, you know, sacrifice or whatever. And it's somehow really the results we're talking about go against some pretty deeply held frames of thinking. And so the people who are doing the translation of the research to a more general audience also have to understand that they sort of have to get what those differences are. And so that process takes a bit longer, perhaps. It's always very easy to make popular communication in favor of the status quo. Sadly, when you want to go change that a bit, it's a bit harder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really helpful, and probably also, as you said, type of innovative ways of communicating. I think also it was in no way a criticism on your presentation, because it was very,
I'm a nerd.
I think, very
It's
clear.
okay.
But yeah, I think Christoph,
We've
you
had
wanted
this,
to ask one
yeah.
question.
And just to quickly add on this, I mean, we've had this very interesting project at ZOE on 1.5-degree lifestyles, and out of this, we developed a toolkit on how to communicate about lifestyles and all of this. We might share it in the chat, and because I mean, it's also how you talk to people, right? I mean, it's not just about presenting the good facts, it's also about emotionally connecting with us and others as human beings, right? I mean, that's such a key part of moving towards a well-being or another society. And honestly, I think that many people are more than ready for this out there. It's maybe rather the political processes and the habitus, like how people are used in policy or in politics to deal with these questions. But apart from that, there's an interesting question from Björn Döring. He's head of unit in DG ECFIN, and he's dealing with the Quest model. I mean, he's in charge of that, and I don't know if you met him already, but I'd like him to pose his question directly. And maybe Björn, if you want to switch on your camera and ask your question, you're more than welcome to join us here on stage.
Thank you, Christoph, for the kind introduction, and Julia, thank you very much for your talk, which I found very inspiring. Although I'm definitely deeply rooted in neoclassical economics, and this is also what we use in our modeling. The question I posted yesterday before hearing you, so you gave part of the answer, but let me reformulate. I was wondering if focusing on energy is not focusing on the easiest part in a way, because we know how to decouple from fossil energy. Whether we are able to do it, that's a different question. And it seems that renewable electricity is potentially abundant. At least that is what Jeremy Rifkin has been going on about for a couple of years. But I think decoupling is much more difficult when it comes to the use of materials or the protection of biodiversity. So do you have any thoughts about these areas?
Thanks, Björn. And so our project is not looking at fossil energy particularly, it's looking at at aggregate energy. And it's much easier to decouple from materials if we don't try to balloon up renewable energy and electrification to the same level, if we're not basically just trying to swap out the infrastructure one for one. So our goal is the reduction, in this project, is the reduction. It's really a degrowth perspective on energy and resource use. So it's not just decoupling from carbon emissions, it's reducing energy demand, full stop. And that means that you can produce that energy with far less renewable technology. It means you don't need as much storage. It means you don't need as much, as much electric vehicles and so on and so forth. So that's really what we're looking at. It's not just about, so I think that does include a material aspect to it. And so the idea is, how do you focus on the ability to lead good lives, have great life plans, have autonomy, have good social participation at the lowest energy and resource use levels possible. That is really our goal. And in terms of the biodiversity aspect, the main threats to biodiversity are animal agriculture. So it's basically back to diets and deforestation, as well as overfishing. So, we're back to plant-based diets as being really the main, as soon as you switch to plant-based diets and reduce the use of fossil fuels, you're basically doing a lot of what you need to be doing on biodiversity. And we could be in a situation If everybody moves to plant-based diets, we could be in a situation where we're able to give, almost half of agricultural land back, which is really extraordinary, which would also do a huge amount for carbon sequestration, obviously.
Thank you.
Great. I'm sure we'll have more other sessions on economic modeling in the future with your project and with other projects and yeah. New indicators. Over to you, Nadia.
Yeah, perfect. So there's still more questions coming in, so I hope we will be able to go through all of them. So I'm trying to cluster them a bit, and there's a few questions wondering about the role of democracy. As you said, that increasing democratic processes and participatory processes is key, especially in these by making provision systems that enable lower energy demand. So one question is, how can increased democracy process deliver on low energy economy in a timely manner? So person says to have a low energy economy would require bold, unpopular, maybe so fast decision that also could be unpopular. And then the second question is if you could also give some more concrete examples. So what does it mean to democratize provisioning systems? How could this be done?
Sure. So this is something I'm really excited about. And I think that there's been this idea in environmental movements that, we kind of need a green dictatorship of some description to impose, wisdom. And that, in my view, I mean, I know that this is something that one can have discussions about, different opinions about, but in my view, such a kind of green dictatorship would be an absolute disaster for a whole bunch of reasons. One reason is that in a crisis situation, you cannot make predictive decisions, like just on the basis of the quality of decisions. You need democratic feedback. You need the critical ability of a democracy to be figuring stuff out and testing it. Because in a situation of crisis, you don't know if you're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. And you might be messing up in ways you have no idea. So this idea that authoritarian decision-making works is really, really flawed because it is not using the full scope of human intelligence and creativity. So it's really sort of a dead end in my view. That's one sort of general philosophical point. In terms of the democracy itself, we have examples of this in terms of citizen assemblies. So it turns out that when you interrogate, this is a really fascinating thing that we're sort of seeing in our time, is that if you interrogate people as consumers, individual consumers through surveys or whatever, they react a certain way as sort of selfish consumers. If you interrogate them as citizens and you put them in, hotel meeting rooms or whatever for a few days, and allow them to interact with climate experts and so on, they propose things that are completely different. And so the level of ambition sort of radical transformative vision that has been put forward by citizens' assemblies on climate and on other topics is really extraordinary. And I think that that's a very concrete example of where real democracy can take us. And we know that representative democracy has all kinds of problems. And one of the reasons it exists, in fact, is to prevent sort of real fast democracy from happening. But democracy can be accelerated through processes like citizens' assemblies, not only, right? This is not a silver bullet. You have to do other things like have good, strong popular movements and popular organizations to sort of keep pushing for things despite the power vested interests. But I guess that's another aspect of democratizing, is that it's basically trying to understand who we're up against. So are we up against selfish humanity? Or are we up against the fossil fuel industry and their powerful lobby forces, and the automotive industry and their powerful lobby forces? And I think that it's also about building up that power. What that looks like specifically, there's somebody who asked in the questions, does democratizing provisioning systems mean taking housing, transport, et cetera, out of market logics? And the answer is absolutely yes. So the point is that to give the most autonomy and control possible back to people so that they can be in charge of their own circumstances. And that's very clear, right? Because right now in liberal democracies, we have representative politics that has a certain realm of action that does not relate to the economy. And the most important decisions are taken in the economy, and we justify them by market logics and not by anything else. the market is supposed to be taking the right decisions for us, and obviously it's not. So I think that that's part of the point, is that through this democratization of our main supply chains, that we can give ourselves the right to take decision-making control back to some extent, or maybe just take it for the first time. Maybe we've never had it. So that's some of these ideas are how we do that through the main supply chains that are driving these environmental impacts. And some examples would be things like housing cooperatives, which can be mega. You can basically take certain pieces and chunks of infrastructure and decision-making strategies out of the private domain and put them back in the public domain, and that yields very interesting results.
Maybe as an in-between question to the next one, what you described there sounds really good and interesting to me, but there seems to be a gap between these ideas and reality. I mean, we've been talking about the assemblies, and we all know the results are very ambitious, but they're not taking up from policy or from the public or whatsoever. And you already mentioned some barriers. You mentioned the fossil fuel industry. You mentioned the market taking over in some spaces where it should not be. Maybe you can describe some more barriers. And I mean, the question is that this in here is, what are the key steps and key agents to change from current economic or economy system to a post-growth one? So that would be very interesting, I think, for everybody here.
Well, I don't have perfect answers. So I do know, but I do know a few things. I know that looking for silver bullets is generally a waste of time. So often people say, what is the one thing I can do that will magically change everything? And that's sadly not how reality works. So there's not one magic technology. There's not one magic form of civic engagement. But all of them together do actually result in a sea change. And so I think that that's one of the really important messages to take home. I think a really important example to keep in mind is the example of the Irish Citizen Assembly on abortion, which was carried forward by intense public interest, so that the whole Irish population really went on the same thinking journey and experience as the Citizen Assembly itself, because so much of the debates were broadcast on Facebook, on television, on whatever, that people sort of really went on the same learning journey. And also the results were pushed forward by a very strong coalition of feminist groups. So on the ground, there was a really large popular mobilization that was never going to let go of that campaign. And that's something that we don't yet have for climate. We have some groups, but they're not at that level of organization and strength and absolute relentlessness. So we really have to be thinking about not just, it's not just the Citizen Assembly. It's not just the communication. It's not just the popular movements. It's a whole bunch of things together that can really force a major cultural shift. And so I think that that's probably what the direction I would say is that we have to be thinking about this multi-pronged strategy. In the words of Engler and Engler in their book, This is an Uprising, they have this idea of pillars, that you have to go up against the different pillars. Your campaign has to realize that it has different pillars for the elected establishment, the media, the police, the whatever, that you're thinking in terms of all of these different institutions and trying to shift each one of them.
Thank you.
We have some other interesting questions also on, because I mean, you also talked already about the global north, global south differences, or also that will be further researched also in a new project. And so one question or comment is, it would be interesting to hear more how this post-growth perspective would look like for low and middle income countries like India, as well as is there an order in which Europe, Global South, and other regions should be moving towards post-growth deals altogether, or should some go ahead and set an example and showcase benefits?
Thanks for that. So I think, we're in a situation of climate crisis, and the at the well into the early stages of the sixth mass extinction. So obviously everybody needs to be moving one way or another all at once. And we have very little time to figure out, you know, to say, oh, we should do it this way or that way. We just, everybody needs to get moving. So it's not, I don't think that we have the luxury of that kind of orderly process that such as is suggested by that question. But I think the important thing is to understand that post-growth probably looks different in different contexts. And it probably looks different, not just depending on the development stage of a country, but also its situation within, you know, global finance. So the entanglements of countries. I think that that's one of the things that we should not underestimate is the entanglements with debt and global finance, both in the public and the private sector that various countries face when they're trying to do these efforts. And that's one of the things that we really want to try to think through in the project is what assemblies of policies would still be possible and protect a country's domestic sphere against those kinds of external pressures. And the fact that the post-growth deals look different for different countries, for different contexts. So it won't always look like the same thing. The policies won't all be the same, but the ultimate goal of going towards more equitable and lower resource consumption, higher quality of life societies should be obviously the same. But I think maybe I can just add that in the project, one of the things we really hope to do through these post-growth deals is come up with proposals and dialogues around what these post-growth deals would contain in terms of policies, packages of policies that political parties and civil society in different places could come up with, could modify, you know, so basically it's having these sort of working proposals in progress that each organization could adapt to their own setting.
Yeah, that's good, interesting, because I feel like at global debates, also at the international climate conferences, I mean, the usual narrative is that so the richer countries need to go first, in a sense, also to leave poor countries some room to grow, etc. So if I understand correctly, you say that also poor countries should adopt, in a sense, policy pathways that are going towards post-growth.
Well, I certainly don't want to be telling any country in the global south what to be doing, because that's pretty much not my place. But I think that one of the things to understand is that this growth trajectory is not necessarily a domestic choice. One of the things to remember is that we have currently a definition of sufficiency of energy and consumption sufficiency in the latest IPCC report, not because global north countries wanted it to be there, but because global south countries wanted it to be there. They were the ones that really imposed it in the end. So I think that that's one of the things to understand, is that our stereotypical understanding of, oh, the global north has to overconsume to keep the global south employed, for instance, that view of the world is maybe not the development that countries in the global south themselves want. They might want a lot more autonomy. They might want to have an economic sphere that is much more geared at making their own quality of life, their own public services, investing in their own infrastructure, rather than making stuff for overconsumption in the global north. So that's one of the things we explicitly want to model, because this is such a talking point that one comes up against with, and you know, we can put numbers on this. Would reductions in overconsumption in the global north result in disaster in the global south? Or, hey, let's be crazy and couple them with cutting the debt. Would it enable the global south to be perfectly fine and actually do its own thing for a change, and actually be able to make their own decisions, as opposed to being trapped in these debt traps that force them to produce a certain way for certain types of currency exchange to happen? So I think that that's one of the really important pieces of the puzzle that we're going to be trying to look at in this project.
Okay, I think we're all interested to see the outcomes of that. And so going a bit in another direction, there's also, so going back to the provisioning systems, there's also one question on, because you talked about public services, health, infrastructure for energy, transport. what is the role? Is any research on also the provisioning of culture, entertainment, sport in a post-growth world? And so a person here, Benjamin, says, my work focuses a lot on sport and sustainable future, but it's hard to justify at what level it should be provisioned for giving the current carbon footprints. Yeah.
And if you could combine this with the research on giving a super appropriate answer in 1 minute, that would be great.
Oh, I'm missing the time. Yeah, it's already late.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Christoph. It will be less than a minute. So this is
take
not
the minute, please. Take the minute.
But so you know, our project cannot do everything, and other people are doing other things. It turns out there's actually a summer school on degrowth and tourism that's happening this year in Switzerland at my university. So this is already something that's being thought about a bit. But we are obviously not the only ones doing everything. And I think that in terms of tourism, culture, and leisure, what we're talking about is that's obviously these are very important aspects, but they are not the immediate focus of our project. However, there are lots of projects on degrowth and post-growth coming up. And, you know, there's room for a lot more people to be thinking about these topics. We are not the guarantors of the only solutions, and we are not the and anyway, Milena is going to be talking a lot more and a lot better about this stuff next week. So looking forward to that. Over to you, Milena.
Do we still have 1 minute for one question, or?
Yeah, I mean, let's take that minute. Go on, one quick question.
Yeah, because I think it's also a very, very interesting one, and especially, I mean, coming from DG Employment, the question is, what does this transition to well-being economic and provisioning imply for work and jobs?
In general, the degrowth, post-growth position on employment is that we should probably be able to provision ourselves sufficiently with a lot less working time. So if we don't have this growth-driven productivity frontier to constantly be scrambling around, we can probably do a lot better with a lot less, including a lot less work time. I think that one of the things that's interesting is that the transformation of our economies is going to require a certain amount of upheaval and real massive investment in some sectors, real massive disinvestment in others. And in this transition period, it might be that we have to do, you know, that there's a lot more work required, let's say just to retrofit houses, like that would be a lot of work that needs doing. So I think that that's one of the interesting things that I'm quite keen to get some handle on is what that transformation process looks like. So maybe we go from certain types of work to other certain types of work to the at some point we can sort of rest on our laurels and work a lot less and have a lot more time for whatever that degrowth leisure looks like.
Great. Thank you, Julia.
Okay, that was exactly 1 minute, so thanks a lot.
Wonderful. And yeah, thanks everybody for being here. And thanks, Julia, for sharing your insights and answering all these questions. And of course, thanks to Frank Simon Thomas and his team and for this great initiative. And thanks to my team who is also supporting a lot. And yeah, feel free to register for our next event with Milena Books on equity, consumption, and the path to sustainable welfare. Certainly is going to be very interesting as well. And yeah, we'll share more details before the event. Have a good day, everybody. Have a good weekend, and see you in Brussels next week at the conference. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Ciao.